"If kindness has a scent," the old baker once whispered, "even a king can find his way to
You
it."
look colder than I
Snow
am.
drifted across the
Please,
palace
share
rooftops
this
like
with me.
scattered feathers, softening the towering walls of Blackthorn Keep while hiding the loneliness that lived inside them.
You look
Every evening,
colder than I
long
am.
after the nobles had
Please,
finished their
share
feast
this with
beneath
me.
crystal chandeliers, the servants disappeared into the narrow stone corridors behind the royal kitchens where no music reached and no one spoke louder than a tired sigh. Clara Bennett balanced a dented tin plate in both hands, careful not to spill the simple meal that marked the end of another 14-hour shift. A slice of coarse bread, a spoonful of vegetable stew, and a single roasted potato were hardly enough to quiet the ache in her stomach, but she had learned years ago that gratitude filled spaces food never could. At 22, Clara had become nearly invisible inside the palace. The head cook remembered her only when another pot needed scrubbing. The steward noticed her only when a floor wasn't polished brightly enough to reflect candlelight. The noble guests never noticed her at all. To them, she was simply another gray apron moving silently through the background, another pair of hands making comfort possible for people who never wondered where comfort came from. She slipped outside through the small service door behind the kitchen, wrapping her worn shawl tighter against the bitter December air. The courtyard beyond was quiet except for the distant crackle of torches and the whisper of wind weaving through the bare oak trees. This was the only place where the palace stopped feeling enormous. Here, surrounded by stacked firewood and empty flour barrels, Clara could pretend the world belonged to ordinary people again. She settled onto an overturned crate, bowed her head for a brief thankful prayer, and lifted her spoon. Before she could take her first bite, she heard the faint scrape of boots against frozen stone. Someone stood just beyond the circle of lantern light. He wore an old dark cloak dusted with snow, its hood pulled low enough to hide most of his face. His clothes looked weathered from long travel, but he carried himself with a strange calm, neither begging nor threatening, simply watching the steam rise from her bowl as though he had almost forgotten what a warm meal looked like. Clara hesitated only long enough to notice the exhaustion in his posture. It reminded her of her late father after endless days repairing fences through harsh winters, too proud to ask for help even when every step hurt. Without thinking twice, she broke her bread in half, slid the plate toward the stranger, and offered a gentle smile. "You look colder than I am," she said softly. "Please, share this with me." The man remained perfectly still, surprised in a way that seemed almost impossible for someone his age. His gloved hand lingered in the air before carefully accepting the plate, as though it weighed far more than bread and stew. He studied Clara with quiet silver eyes that reflected the lantern flame, eyes carrying the kind of sadness that belonged to someone who had spent too many nights surrounded by people, yet known by none of them. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They simply shared the humble meal beneath the falling snow while the grand palace behind them overflowed with untouched desserts, polished silver, and laughter that somehow sounded farther away than the stars. When the last bite was gone, the stranger stood, gave the slightest respectful nod, and disappeared into the darkness without offering his name. Clara watched until the night swallowed him completely, smiling to herself before returning inside, never imagining that before another sunset, every servant in Blackthorn Keep would whisper about the mysterious traveler who had vanished without leaving a single footprint behind the palace walls. The next evening arrived wrapped in another curtain of falling snow, and Clara found herself glancing toward the small service door far more often than she cared to admit. She tried convincing herself it was only curiosity. Travelers came and went. Hungry strangers sometimes wandered close to the outer walls before the guards sent them away. There was no reason to expect the quiet man to return. Still, every time the kitchen door creaked open, her heart lifted for just a moment before settling back into disappointment. The dinner rush consumed the palace as it always did. Noble guests demanded fresh bread before the baskets emptied. The head cook barked instructions until his voice echoed against the stone ceiling. Clara hurried from stove to pantry carrying heavy pots that steamed against the cold winter air drifting through the loading entrance. Flour dust clung to her sleeves while the scent of rosemary and roasted vegetables filled the room. By the time the final trays disappeared into the royal dining hall, her feet ached so deeply that each step felt heavier than the last. When the servants were finally dismissed, Clara quietly collected her modest supper. Tonight it was a bowl of thick barley soup, a small apple, and another piece of crusty bread. She slipped outside, almost embarrassed by the tiny hope she refused to name. The courtyard looked exactly as it had the night before, silent except for the wind brushing across the frozen ground. She waited a few seconds before sitting on the old crate. Perhaps she had imagined the entire encounter. Perhaps the stranger had already continued his journey. She had just lifted her spoon when a familiar voice spoke from the darkness. "You came back." Clara turned so quickly that a little soup splashed over the edge of the bowl. The man stood beneath the same bare oak tree, snowflakes resting on the shoulders of his weathered cloak. This time he lowered his hood enough for the lantern light to reveal more of his face. His features were calm and thoughtful, marked by quiet confidence instead of hardship, yet his silver eyes still carried the same loneliness she had noticed before. Clara smiled before she could stop herself. "I was about to say the same thing." The stranger stepped closer but remained respectful, leaving several feet between them. "May I join you again?" Clara laughed softly. "Only if you promise to help me finish this bread. It is always harder than it looks." For the first time, the corners of his mouth lifted into a genuine smile. It transformed his entire expression, making him appear years younger. He accepted the bread carefully, as though even the smallest kindness deserved gratitude. They ate together in comfortable silence until he finally asked, "Do they always give you so little after such a long day?" Clara shrugged. "It is enough. Besides, someone always has less than I do." He studied her for a long moment. "Most people protect what little they have." She broke the apple cleanly into 2 pieces and handed him the larger half. Food tastes better when it is shared. The stranger looked down at the fruit in his hand as though no one had ever offered him something so ordinary. After a thoughtful pause, he asked, "If you could sit anywhere inside this palace, where would you choose?" Clara glanced toward the glowing windows of the royal residence and smiled with quiet amusement. "Right here." He seemed surprised. "Not the grand dining hall." She shook her head. "People inside those walls spend so much time pretending to impress each other that I doubt they notice what they are eating. Out here, a warm meal and honest company are enough." The man did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the brilliant palace windows before returning his gaze to Clara. There was a softness in his expression now, as though her simple words had reached a place no title or fortune ever could. When the castle bells rang the late evening hour, he rose once more. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For the meal?" Clara asked. He held her eyes for a brief moment. "For reminding me what home is supposed to feel like." Before she could ask what he meant, he disappeared once again into the snowy night, leaving Clara with the strange feeling that she had just spoken to someone carrying far more than the weight of an old winter cloak. Over the next several nights, an unspoken rhythm quietly settled into Clara's life. She finished her duties in the bustling royal kitchen, accepted the small supper reserved for the servants, and stepped into the peaceful courtyard where the snow softened every sound. Without fail, the mysterious traveler appeared a few minutes later, never early enough to seem eager and never late enough to make her wonder if he had forgotten. They shared whatever she carried, sometimes warm potato soup, sometimes thick vegetable stew, sometimes nothing more than bread and cheese. Yet each meal somehow felt richer than the magnificent banquets prepared only a few yards away. The stranger never complained, never asked for more, and always thanked her with the same quiet sincerity. Little by little, their conversations became longer. He asked unusual questions that no ordinary traveler would think to ask. "If you could change one rule inside this palace, what would it be?" Clara stirred her soup thoughtfully before answering. "I would make sure every servant sat down to eat before the food reached the nobles." He tilted his head with genuine curiosity. "Even if the guests complained?" She smiled. "Hungry people cannot serve with happy hearts." Another evening he asked, "What makes someone worthy of respect?" Clara answered almost immediately, "The way they treat people who cannot offer them anything in return." He looked into the flickering lantern light without speaking, as though weighing every word she had said. On another night, he surprised her again. "Do you think kings are lonely?" Clara laughed softly. "I have never met one." "Pretend you have." She considered the question for several seconds. "I think the higher someone stands, the harder it becomes to know who truly cares about them. People might bow because they have to, not because they want to." The stranger lowered his eyes, hiding a faint smile that looked almost bittersweet. That is a wise answer. She shrugged with gentle embarrassment. It is only a guess. What Clara never noticed was that each morning the palace seemed to change in tiny, impossible ways. A broken hinge on the pantry door was quietly repaired overnight. The elderly dishwasher suddenly received a new pair of warm boots after years of wearing worn leather. The youngest kitchen boy found a heavy winter coat waiting beside his locker with no note explaining who had left it there. Even the head cook, whose temper usually arrived before sunrise, seemed strangely restrained whenever Clara happened to be nearby. The servants whispered that perhaps good fortune had finally remembered the forgotten corners of Blackthorn Keep, but no one could explain why. One snowy evening Clara arrived carrying only a small bowl of oatmeal, because the pantry had run low after an unexpected feast for visiting nobles. She looked apologetically at the stranger. "I am afraid tonight is not much of a dinner." He accepted the bowl with the same gratitude as always. "It is more than enough." She watched him take the first spoonful and laughed. "You always say that." "Because it is always true." He paused before asking another unexpected question. "Do you ever wish to leave this place?" Clara looked toward the towering palace walls glowing beneath hundreds of lanterns. "Sometimes. But then I remember there are kind people everywhere if you are willing to notice them. Even here." She nodded confidently. "Especially here. I believe every heart carries a story that nobody else can see." For the first time since they had met, the stranger seemed unable to answer. His silver eyes rested on Clara with quiet admiration, as though she had uncovered a truth he had spent years searching for. At that very moment, the distant sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the courtyard. Two royal guards crossed the far walkway carrying bright lanterns, speaking urgently to one another. "Search every corner of the outer grounds," one of them called. "His Majesty left the palace again after sunset, and no one knows where he went." Clara instinctively turned toward the voices, but when she looked back only a heartbeat later, the crate beside her was empty. The bowl had been carefully washed and placed upside down on the wooden box, and the mysterious traveler had vanished into the silent winter night once again. The palace awoke the next morning beneath a cloud of uneasiness that even the aroma of fresh bread could not hide. Servants whispered while carrying baskets through the corridors. Guards doubled their patrols around every entrance. Stable hands spoke in hushed voices as though afraid the walls themselves might be listening. Clara noticed it the moment she entered the kitchen. The head cook, who normally shouted before sunrise, stood unusually quiet while reading a sealed notice stamped with the royal crest. Beside him, the steward instructed everyone to remain alert and report any unfamiliar face seen near the palace grounds. Rumors spread faster than steam rising from the ovens. Some claimed a spy had slipped inside Blackthorn Keep. Others insisted a mysterious traveler had been seen wandering close to the royal residence several nights in a row. One young servant even whispered that His Majesty himself had ordered secret inspections after disappearing without explanation during the evenings. Clara kept washing vegetables while pretending not to hear, but each rumor tightened a small knot inside her chest. She remembered the quiet stranger sitting beneath the oak tree, patiently sharing bread without asking for anything except conversation. Nothing about him had felt dangerous. If anything, he had carried the quiet sadness of someone searching for peace rather than trouble. Throughout the day, she caught herself glancing toward the snowy courtyard through the narrow kitchen windows. She wondered whether he had heard the growing commotion. She hoped he had chosen to stay away until everything settled. Yet another part of her quietly wished he would come back. By sunset, the palace had become even busier. Lanterns lined every stone pathway. Pairs of guards walked careful circles around the gardens and service entrances. Even the small gate behind the kitchen remained unlocked only under direct watch. Clara carried trays into the servants' dining room while overhearing two guards speaking just outside the doorway. "The order is simple," one of them said. "Question anyone lingering near the western courtyard after dark." The second guard nodded. "No exceptions." Clara lowered her eyes and continued working, but her thoughts drifted back to the familiar silver eyes that had listened so carefully whenever she spoke. That evening her supper was smaller than usual, only a bowl of creamy potato soup and half a loaf of rye bread. She stood beside the service door longer than normal, uncertain whether stepping outside was foolish. Finally, she smiled at herself. Sharing one meal had never harmed anyone. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and slipped quietly into the cold night. Snowflakes drifted gently through the lantern light. The old crate remained where it always had, dusted with fresh snow. She waited. 1 minute passed, then another. The courtyard stayed empty except for the distant footsteps of patrolling guards. Clara exhaled softly, feeling more disappointed than she expected. She sat down anyway, lifted her spoon, and whispered into the quiet air, "I suppose tonight you decided to be sensible." A faint chuckle answered from behind the stack of firewood. She turned, unable to hide her smile. The stranger stepped into the lantern glow, brushing snow from his cloak. "I almost did," he admitted. "Then why did you come?" she asked. His expression grew thoughtful as he looked directly at her. "Because there are very few places where people welcome me before asking who I am." Clara slid the bread toward him exactly as she had every night before. "Then you should eat before someone changes my mind." He accepted the bread with grateful eyes, but before either of them could speak again, the sharp beam of a patrol lantern swept across the courtyard stones, and the sound of approaching footsteps echoed closer than ever before. Clara's smile faded as the glow of the approaching lantern swept across the frozen ground. The stranger did not panic. Instead, he calmly placed the bread back onto the plate and looked toward the narrow path where the guards were drawing closer. "You should go," Clara whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. He looked at her for a long moment before quietly asking, "Would that make things easier for you?" She glanced toward the kitchen door and then back at him. Every sensible thought told her to walk away. She barely knew this man. The palace was searching for someone. If the rumors were true, she could lose the only home she had ever known simply by standing there. Yet the memory of every conversation they had shared returned to her all at once. She remembered the gratitude in his voice when she offered him half of her supper, the way he listened instead of judging, and the kindness that quietly shined through his reserved nature. She shook her head. "No, running would only make everyone believe you have done something wrong." The stranger's silver eyes softened. Before he could answer, 2 royal guards stepped around the corner carrying bright lanterns that filled the courtyard with golden light. Both men stopped the instant they noticed Clara standing beside the cloaked traveler. "There they are," one guard called. "Do not move." Clara instinctively stepped half a pace forward, placing herself between the guards and the stranger without even realizing she had done it. The older guard frowned with confusion rather than anger. "Miss Bennet, who is this man?" Clara swallowed carefully. She had promised herself she would always tell the truth whenever possible. "I do not know his name," she answered honestly. "He is a traveler who has shared supper with me several evenings." The younger guard exchanged a worried glance with his partner. "Do you realize the palace has been searching for an unidentified visitor?" Clara nodded. "I heard the rumors." "Then why continue meeting him?" the older guard asked. Clara looked back at the stranger for only a second before answering. "Because I judged him by his actions instead of the rumors." Silence settled over the courtyard. Even the wind seemed to pause. The guards studied the mysterious traveler, expecting him to defend himself, but he remained perfectly composed. Finally, the older guard spoke again, though his voice had grown noticeably gentler. "Sir, we must ask you to leave the palace grounds until further notice." The stranger inclined his head respectfully. "I understand." He turned toward Clara with the same calm expression she had come to recognize over the past several evenings. "Thank you for every meal." She forced a small smile despite the disappointment growing inside her. "Please stay warm." Without another word, he disappeared into the snowy darkness before either guard attempted to stop him. They simply watched him go. After several moments, the younger guard looked back at Clara with puzzled curiosity. "You really trusted someone you had never met before?" Clara picked up the nearly untouched bowl of soup and quietly replied, "Sometimes people tell you who they are long before they ever tell you their name." Neither guard responded. They escorted her back inside the palace, where whispers spread almost as quickly as the story itself. By sunrise, nearly every servant had heard that Clara Bennet had been secretly sharing her meals with the mysterious stranger the guards had been searching for. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others warned she would surely lose her position. Even the steward looked at her differently, no longer with simple indifference, but with cautious suspicion. Clara returned to her work without arguing with anyone, though every evening afterward she still found herself glancing toward the small service door, wondering why the courtyard suddenly felt much colder than it ever had before. 3 evenings passed without a single sign of the mysterious traveler. The overturned crate behind the kitchen remained untouched beneath fresh layers of snow, and Clara found herself slowing her steps each night before quietly reminding herself that waiting would not change anything. Inside Blackthorn Keep, however, the atmosphere shifted in ways no one could explain. Servants rushed through polished hallways carrying silver trays brighter than usual. Fresh, evergreen garlands decorated every archway. The royal orchestra rehearsed from sunrise until dusk, filling the palace with elegant melodies that drifted even into the kitchens. Something important was about to happen. Shortly after dawn on the fourth day, the steward entered the kitchen holding a scroll sealed with dark blue wax. His expression was unusually serious. "Every servant is to report to the Grand Hall before noon," he announced. "His Majesty has called a full royal assembly. Attendance is mandatory." Whispering spread through the kitchen almost instantly. Some believed a neighboring kingdom had arrived. Others feared new palace rules after the recent security concerns. Clara remained quiet as she tied on a clean apron and finished preparing the morning bread, though she could not shake the strange feeling growing inside her. By midday, the enormous grand hall shimmered beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Nobles stood in elegant rows wearing velvet coats and sparkling jewelry, while servants gathered quietly along the marble walls, careful not to draw attention to themselves. Clara had never seen so many people gathered beneath one roof. Every eye eventually turned toward the towering throne at the far end of the room. The royal trumpets sounded once. Massive oak doors slowly opened. The room instantly fell silent. A line of royal guards entered first, followed by distinguished advisors dressed in deep blue robes. Then the king appeared. He wore a midnight-colored ceremonial coat embroidered with silver thread that caught the light with every step. A polished crown rested upon his dark hair, and a long white cloak flowed behind him with quiet dignity. Every noble bowed. Every servant lowered their head. Clara did the same until a familiar voice filled the hall. "You may all rise." Her heart skipped. She knew that voice. Slowly, almost afraid to look, she lifted her eyes toward the throne. The king stood only a short distance away, his silver eyes calmly sweeping across the crowded hall. Without the worn cloak and snow upon his shoulders, he looked every bit the ruler of a great kingdom. Yet there was no mistaking the gentle expression she had seen beneath the lantern light night after night. The spoon slipped from Clara's trembling fingers and landed softly against the marble floor. She stared in complete disbelief. It was him, the quiet traveler who had shared bread on an old wooden crate. The man who had thanked her for ordinary soup as though it were a royal feast. The stranger who had disappeared before every patrol reached the courtyard now stood before the entire kingdom as its sovereign. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the vast hall. The king's expression did not change, yet Clara recognized the faint warmth hidden behind his composed smile. It was the same look he had worn every evening when she divided her supper without hesitation. Around her, servants continued bowing respectfully, completely unaware that the humble kitchen maid standing among them had unknowingly shared countless meals with the very ruler they now honored. Clara could scarcely breathe as one impossible thought echoed through her mind again and again. She had never fed a wandering traveler at all. She had been sharing her own plate with the king every single night. The grand hall remained so quiet that Clara could hear her own heartbeat echoing louder than the distant crackle of the fireplaces. She lowered her eyes at once, convinced she had made a terrible mistake simply by looking toward the throne. Around her, every servant stood perfectly still while the nobles waited for the king to begin speaking. When His Majesty finally stepped forward, his voice carried the same calm warmth Clara remembered from the snowy courtyard. Yet now it filled every corner of the palace with effortless authority. "For many years," he began, "I have heard countless speeches about loyalty, generosity, and honor. I have watched people compete for recognition, hoping to impress the crown with carefully chosen words. But words are easiest to offer when everyone is watching." His gaze moved slowly across the assembled crowd. "Character is revealed when no one believes it matters." A ripple of quiet curiosity spread through the hall. Even the royal advisors exchanged puzzled glances. The king continued, "Several evenings ago, I left this palace wearing neither a crown nor fine clothing. I carried no symbol of authority. I wished to learn how a stranger would be treated when there was nothing to gain from showing kindness. Clara felt every word settle heavily upon her heart. She remembered the worn cloak, the shared bread, the simple conversations beneath falling snow. None of it had been accidental. Every evening had been a test she never realized she was taking. The king paused before asking one simple question. Is there anyone in this hall who shared their own supper with an unknown traveler outside the western kitchen? Silence answered him. Nobles looked at one another with uncertain expressions. A few servants glanced around the room, but quickly lowered their heads again. Clara remained frozen where she stood. Every instinct told her to disappear into the crowd. She had never wanted attention. She had only wanted to help someone who seemed lonely. After several long seconds, the king's voice softened. There is no reason to be afraid. Clara slowly raised her trembling hand. The movement was small, almost hesitant, yet it seemed impossible to hide inside the enormous hall. The steward stared at her in complete disbelief. The head cook blinked twice as though he had misunderstood what he was seeing. Whispering spread through the servants gathered along the walls. The king smiled with unmistakable recognition. Please come forward, Miss Clara Bennett. Her legs felt impossibly heavy as she walked across the polished marble floor. Every pair of eyes followed her. She stopped several feet from the throne and lowered her head respectfully. Your Majesty, she whispered, still unable to believe the quiet traveler and the king were the same man. He looked at her with the same gentle expression he had worn while accepting half a loaf of bread beneath the winter sky. Tell me, he asked kindly, when you first saw me outside the kitchen, what did you believe I was? Clara answered honestly, just as she always had. A tired man who looked hungry. A faint smile crossed the king's face. Nothing more. She shook her head. Nothing more was necessary. Warm laughter quietly spread through parts of the hall, not in mockery, but in admiration of her simple answer. The king nodded thoughtfully before speaking so that everyone present could hear. While many inside these walls searched for status, Miss Bennet noticed only need. She never asked my title. She never expected a reward. She divided every meal, because compassion had already become her habit. The whispering stopped completely. In that unforgettable moment, every noble, every servant, and every royal official understood that the quiet kitchen maid standing before the throne had accomplished something no amount of wealth, influence, or ceremony could ever purchase. She had earned the king's trust simply by treating a stranger with ordinary kindness when she believed no one else would ever know. No one spoke after the king's words settled across the grand hall. The silence itself seemed to carry more weight than any royal decree. Clara remained standing before the throne with her hands folded, wishing she could quietly return to the kitchens where life had always been simple. Instead, every eye in the room rested upon her. The king slowly descended the marble steps, closing the distance between himself and the young maid who had never once treated him differently than any other weary traveler. When he stopped beside her, he turned to face the assembled court. Many of you have wondered why small changes have appeared throughout this palace during the past several weeks, he said. A repaired pantry door, warm boots for an elderly servant, a winter coat left for a kitchen boy, better meals served to those who prepare yours. Murmurs spread through the hall as servants exchanged surprised glances. The king nodded gently. Those changes were not accidents. They were reminders. A kingdom cannot become truly prosperous if kindness is reserved only for those seated at the highest table. His words settled deeply over the gathering. He then looked toward the palace steward. Tell me, how many years has Miss Bennet faithfully served this household? The steward quickly lowered his head. Nearly 6 years, Your Majesty. And during those years, how many times was she recognized for her work? The steward hesitated. His silence answered before he could. The king did not raise his voice. He simply let the question remain in the air until everyone understood it. Next, he turned toward the head cook. Has she ever refused an assignment? Never, Your Majesty, the cook admitted quietly. Has she ever been disrespectful? No, Your Majesty. Has she ever placed herself before others? The head cook slowly shook his head. She has not. The king smiled faintly before returning his attention to the entire court. Then why did it take a stranger wearing an old cloak for her generosity to be noticed? No one answered. Several nobles lowered their eyes. Others shifted uncomfortably where they stood. There was no accusation in the king's voice, only disappointment that goodness had become so easy to overlook. He turned back toward Clara, who still appeared overwhelmed by everything unfolding around her. "Miss Bennet," he said warmly, "during every meal we shared, you believed I had nothing to offer you." Clara nodded softly. "That is true, Your Majesty. Yet you continued to divide your supper, because I thought no one should eat alone." A gentle smile crossed the king's face. "And that answer is precisely why you stand here today." He reached into the pocket of his ceremonial coat and carefully removed something wrapped in clean white linen. As he unfolded the cloth, Clara gasped quietly. Resting inside was the simple wooden spoon she had unknowingly left beside her bowl on the very first evening they met. It had been cleaned, polished, and preserved with obvious care. "Do you recognize this?" he asked. Clara smiled through misting eyes. "I thought I had lost it." "You did not lose it," the king replied. "I kept it because it reminded me that the greatest gifts are rarely expensive. Sometimes they are offered by tired hands after a long day's work, expecting nothing in return." He gently placed the spoon back into Clara's hands. "May everyone gathered here remember that true nobility is measured not by the crown someone wears, but by the compassion they show when they believe no reward is waiting for them." Throughout the grand hall, servants looked toward Clara with new respect, while many of the nobles quietly reflected upon the lesson they had witnessed. Without anger, without humiliation, and without a single harsh word, the king had reminded the entire kingdom that genuine greatness always begins with ordinary kindness. Winter slowly gave way to the first gentle signs of spring, and with the changing season came quiet changes throughout Blackthorn Keep that no royal proclamation could have accomplished alone. Servants no longer hurried through the halls with their eyes fixed on the floor. They greeted one another with genuine smiles, shared extra bread without being asked, and paused to help those carrying burdens too heavy for one person. The palace had not become perfect overnight, but kindness, once nearly invisible, had become impossible to ignore. Clara Bennet returned to the royal kitchen the very next morning wearing the same simple apron she had always worn. Although many expected her to accept a grand position close to the throne, she politely asked to remain where she felt most useful. The king respected her decision without hesitation. Instead of removing her from the life she loved, he appointed her royal steward of hospitality, giving her the authority to ensure that every servant, apprentice, traveler, and guest would always be treated with dignity and offered a warm meal before leaving the palace. It was not the title that made Clara happiest. It was watching the elderly dishwasher receive help before lifting heavy buckets, seeing the youngest kitchen workers finally sit down to eat while their food was still warm, and hearing laughter return to the servants' dining room after years of quiet exhaustion. Several evenings later, long after another successful royal banquet had ended, Clara carried 2 familiar plates through the small service door behind the kitchen. Snow had melted from the courtyard, revealing the weathered wooden crate where everything had begun. She smiled as she placed both plates side by side. A few moments later, calm footsteps crossed the stone path. The king arrived without his ceremonial cloak or jeweled crown, dressed instead in the same plain coat he had worn during those unforgettable winter nights. For the first time since revealing his identity, there were no guards nearby, no formal ceremony, and no audience waiting to witness the meeting. There were only 2 friends sharing a peaceful meal beneath the evening sky. The king sat on the old crate and looked at the simple supper before him with unmistakable satisfaction. Warm vegetable stew, fresh bread, and 2 polished wooden spoons rested between them. Clara laughed softly. "I am afraid the royal chefs still have not learned to prepare anything as impressive as the feasts inside." He smiled as he picked up one piece of bread. "I disagree." She raised an amused eyebrow. "Really?" He nodded. "The finest banquet I have ever attended was served right here, beside this kitchen door, by someone who believed I was simply another hungry traveler." Clara lowered her eyes with quiet humility before breaking the bread exactly as she had on the very first night, placing half onto his plate without a second thought. The king accepted it with the same gratitude he had shown from the beginning. Some things, they both understood, should never change. As the palace lights shimmered across the peaceful courtyard, the distance between a throne and a servant seemed to disappear completely, replaced by mutual respect earned through ordinary moments of compassion. Years later, visitors to Blackthorn Keep often wondered why every traveler who knocked at the palace gates was welcomed with warm bread before being asked a single question. The answer was never written in history books or carved into marble walls. It lived quietly inside a simple wooden spoon preserved within the royal household, reminding every generation that the strongest kingdom is not built by crowns, riches, or power alone, but by people who choose kindness before they know who is standing in front of them.